This is Growth Guide, a podcast exploring the depths of curiosity, questioning everything in the name of growth. I'm your host, Brian D'Alessandro. It's not every day that you get to speak with one of the greatest graphic designers that ever lived. When I started off as a designer almost 20 years ago, his work showed me a bold and brazen way to approach design challenges that helped reshape my perspective. My guest today is Austrian graphic designer Stefan Sagmeister. Stefan is a storyteller and typographer based in New York City, but he's so much more than that. Along with winning almost every prestigious design award out there, Stefan has a Grammy Award for the limited edition box set he designed for the Talking Heads. This episode is also not just for designers. We talk about happiness, meditation, therapy, exercise, and working for his hero, Tibor Kalman. What took my love of Stefan to the next level is the work he's done to be a better human being and to live a more fulfilling life. Instead of the force-fed concept of retirement, Stefan decided to never retire and just take a one-year sabbatical every 7 years. During his second sabbatical, he undertook a project to explore happiness. Well, this turned into a much bigger endeavor, and the result is a beautiful documentary called The Happy Film. So excited to dive into this and so many more topics today, so let's get into it. So thrilled to be here with you today, the design legend, and you have touched so many other mediums as well, which I really am excited to jump into today.
Super happy to be here, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have a diverse group of listeners out there. Not all of them are designers. So I just want to set the stage a little bit, because when I was still a pimple-faced, wannabe designer, I've heard you describe yourself as a designer who does art and have dabbled in filmmaking, but designer at heart. And, I had studied fine arts traditionally and found myself in the design world. And so I was kind of the opposite there. And I always resonated with your approach because there's a heavy focus on typography and storytelling through that, but you've always used so many mediums. And this is gone from bananas to inflatables to weaving and fences, mosaics. I remember even, I believe, skin, where there was scars in there, and it just resonated so much. So your bravery in design has always really stood out.
Thank you. I found that here and there, I would say, because you mentioned bravery, I myself am actually not a particular brave person. So I'm pretty, I would say that I was born, or my constituency, or my fiber is actually quite scary. So I'm the kind of person who has to talk himself into, jumping over anxiety and fear. And sometimes I do that more successful than others. I feel that this comes in waves.
But you do it. And that's where, so maybe I'll tweak the word from brave to courageous, because courage is stepping forward in the face of fear. And from what I've been exposed to of your work, and has really struck me beyond just the design world, and we'll get into it, there's great courage in it.
Thank you. Well, if that is the case, or if that translates, I would be super happy. I remember I'm not a big quoter of other people, but I remember about 10 years ago, I heard an interview with the small trainer of Mike Tyson. And he said in that interview that something along the line, I paraphrase, something along the line of that the hero and the coward are both scared shitless. It's just the fact that the hero can somehow find a way to overcome that fear, which struck me as just the way that he didn't see it as a quote. He said it somewhere in the context, and it just struck me as incredibly wise.
I really appreciated your vulnerability and honesty with how you were approaching it as an experiment, and just really, open to the whole thing. And it really struck me.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, I think that as soon as it became clear that this whole film that I had originally planned as a general movie about happiness didn't really work out, and it's not going to happen. And it's going to be a film about my own happiness, because that's really the only thing that I knew something about. Then it was pretty clear that I at least had to give it a good shot in trying to be as honest as I could make it.
That's something I've witnessed in your work. And, I'll jump right into one of the, things that brought you back onto the radar for me beyond design was when you were exploring the happy film. And I think you called it a graphic design experiment. And experiment is really how I saw you approaching it. But can you talk a little bit about that project?
Well, I think it started originally by me doing a talk, a presentation that with the filter of happiness attached. So basically I was showing what we've done in the past, but I now ordered it into, was this a project that made us happy as designers? And from the feedback that we got, is it reasonable to assume that the people who saw this or used it, that their happiness level was increased? And I basically showed all the work through that filter. Yes or no, no, this was terrible, no, this was good, no, this was the feedback, and so on. And this was a very successful presentation, as in I felt that the audience was much more engaged with that filter applied than when I just showed the work before. And then, as I've been doing all this. This was the second sabbatical. I've been doing sabbaticals throughout my career. And for the second one, I was in Bali. And after I was working a lot on furniture that would go into the studio that was supposed to be renovated in New York while I was in Bali, a friend came over, a very close friend of mine, still one of my best friends. I actually literally just talked to him half an hour before this interview, or before. He thought that me designing furniture for my own studio was kind of a waste of time, and that I had some responsibility to do something that might be more useful for other people. And I felt that he had a point, and then I gave that some more thought. And having done those presentations, I thought maybe I should do a bigger piece of work on happiness. And the initial thought, of course, was to do something on general happiness. And because it would have been easy to do a book, and I thought, let's do a film just for the challenge sake, because I've never done a film before.
And how were you defining happiness at that time?
You know what? I am not sure if I had a definition at the time. I think that the decision to make a film, of course, first prompted a long period of research. So what that meant really in real life was that I had many dozens of books on the subject sent over, and that I started to, from the books that I liked, I started to contact some of those people. But I'm not sure if at that point I really had a good definition on happiness.
Was there a feeling that, like a signature that you associated with happiness?
I mean, I think at that point, the overall trajectory was, it's a classic graphic design, or it's a classic communication design problem, because it's a huge amount of information out there, and I will have to look at all of that information and somehow make it communicatable, in this case, within 90 minutes, roughly within a 90-minute movie project. So from that end, I felt the thing that could come out of it is that I'm making a bad film, The best thing that could come out of it, that all this research would give me new insights into my own living and well-being, and I might even get happier in the process. That was sort of the idea. But I think beyond that, I didn't really know all that much. Then, of course, as I read, I'm not sure, I probably read 100 books roughly.
Wow.
And one of the best ones I actually read pretty soon in the beginning. And that was Jonathan Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis. That just I felt was this fantastic mix between pretty well-written and precise overview of how the term or how the world of happiness had evolved through human endeavors. Like, I think starting with the Greeks and then going through the various philosophical thinking strands from the Stoics, all the way into the Renaissance and the 19th century, and how our view of it changed to a pretty well, but I felt a pretty well-grounded world of how happiness now is seen within the world of psychology, particularly within the world of positive psychology. And he was clearly one of the founders of that movement. He had studied with Seligman, who I think originally coined the term. And I read Seligman, but I found that actually that the students of Seligman spoke to me more than Seligman himself. And so I read, I don't know, maybe half a dozen of the students of Seligman, which basically I think were the big positive psychologists of our time. Danny Gilbert at Harvard, and Diener at Diener, and Jonathan Haidt, with whom I contacted, and I'm still friends with both of them. His wife is, very much an artist, designer. So he actually knew who I was, and we got along quite well over email, and then met, and he was, happy to be involved, and said, well, I asked if he would be willing to be the scientific advisor, which he was. And so he looked at the project throughout its development. And then, it fairly quickly, I think, while I was still on sabbatical in Bali, I also had access to a Channel 13 TV series that Danny Gilbert had done. And I had met Danny Gilbert before. He was a big TED speaker, and I found him to be an incredibly engaging speaker and organizer. And when I saw the series he had done on Channel 13, I found it only mediocre. And that sort of shocked me, because I felt if Danny Gilbert, one of the pillars of this profession, and he really has the right profession, he can call up anybody in the world and will respond to him. If he can't get a proper film being made, why do I think, who doesn't have that background, who doesn't have this education, that I could pull this off? And then I thought, well, I better pivot and make this a film about my own happiness, make it hopefully very personable, because at least I'm an expert on that.
Yeah, and you have the most to gain from it as well.
It also felt more doable, because that would then mean that I can really look at my own development, rather than to have to go out there and interview a lot of people. And we actually had started that, we had started interviewing scientists, and I felt it wasn't all that interesting for two reasons. One is that it started to become this documentary with a lot of talking heads. There was a lot of people, giving their opinion. And I felt that a lot of the scientists that I had interviewed before the camera was on, told me all these interesting things. But once the camera was on, they became much more careful with what they had to say. And it became this kind of a little wishy-washy, well, maybe this, maybe that kind of thing. It just didn't seem that juicy, the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting, this notion of bringing too much data or information around intellectualizing happiness, which is an emotional state. It's very easy to become divorced from what it's really about in essence.
I also noticed that even in the books that I read, that whenever a scientist talked about her own experience, like she took this drug or tried this out herself, for all of these things, it became immediately so much more interesting than when the same scientist talked about a study that she had commissioned with 1,500 people. Now, this, of course, made no scientific sense. Of course, the study would tell you much more than anecdotal evidence of her own experience. But from an interesting point of view, the personal experience was much higher for me.
Yeah, and as a viewer, I could say that for me, I connected with these people's personal stories and experiences, and that gave me, and that's what I was seeking without even realizing it. I mean, I was pursuing growth and personal development, and I think that's what I was gravitating towards in the film. But it's these anecdotes that really made me feel connected. And I remember one of yours, you did this experiment where I believe you were in Union Square. And you were, why don't you tell it?
Well, basically, at the time, this was during the second experiment. Basically, Jonathan had written in one chapter that in his experience, the three most efficient way to boost your own well-being would be meditation, therapy, and drugs. This is legal drugs like, mostly SSRIs. And I said, fantastic, I'll try them all out and report back. So this basically became, I would say, sort of the structure, the backbone of the film. 3-part film. First experiment, meditation. We went back to Bali, did that for 3 months. Second experiment, therapy. Of course, I did. This was perfect in New York. There's lots of therapies. Do that for 3 months. And then 3 drugs, like try out, get a proper pharmaceutical psychologist to, prescribe a proper drug for me and try that out. And then in the second one, in the cognitive therapy segment, my therapist thought that I should go more out of my regular comfort zone. Basically, it was great because she gave me homework. And I think one homework was that to do something that I feel really uncomfortable doing. And when I gave that some thought, it would be, I would feel incredibly uncomfortable having to talk to any cold on the street, but particularly to a woman cold on the street. So off we went with a camera to Union Square, trying to basically give away flowers. And I think that the goal was to get a phone number of a woman shopping at the green market on Union Square, which turned out to be as uncomfortable as I thought it would be.
Yeah, did you learn anything in particular from that experience?
I would say that it got easier over time. So I probably, in those hours that I was over there, I probably asked maybe 30, got rejected a good 28 times, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think I learned, so like the bigger thing that I would learn for me would be that all of these things get easier. What I would have learned, but never really applied again, was that it's stupid to ask people as they are moving. But I only noticed that later when people ask me on the street, is that I'll be much more responsive if I'm already standing than if I'm moving, because it's sort of, you're already in some sort of trajectory.
Yeah, it's a moving target, right? It's like
Yes.
that saying.
Yeah. And it was funny because we were shooting this, we had two female production assistants with us that ran after the women who rejected me, because in documentary film you cannot show any person that you don't have a release form from.
Mm-hmm.
And these production assistants reported back to me afterwards, after it was all over, that a number of the women who had rejected me, by the time the production assistant had caught up with them, were on the phone telling a girlfriend, "Oh, the nicest just happened to me. This guy tried to give a flower to me, but I just walked by." So it literally was that trajectory that was part of the rejection.
Very interesting. So that brings about, like, okay, what is the right strategy for how to approach people? But I've actually experienced a similar uncomfortable situation in Union Square when I was filming for a company I started up, a hemp food company, and we were doing testimonials. So we were trying to get people to try free product and tell us what they thought of it. And that same fear of rejection is so deep in me. I could be an anxious person, at start. And so one of the things I learned is it's definitely hardest at first, but also the fear only lives in the anticipation. The second I get into motion, that kind of disappears because I'm task oriented and I'm just like I'm creative then. Then it's like, okay, how do I work through this? If they are moving or if they're on the phone, how do I use humor, eye contact? How do I try to connect?
All very true. All very true.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Well, what are some of the things that you left behind from the film and others that you've held on to?
I would say, let's just basically start with the biggies. I think my premise of the film was the idea that I was hoping or thinking that I could train my mind in the same way that I could train my body to basically become happier. I had trained for a marathon once, even though I'm very sporty, and finished a marathon slowly but properly. And in that process of the 1 year training, I completely realized that, yes, I will never be able to run a marathon in a record time, but I could become incredibly better within my own performance, like incredibly better.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't it be fantastic if this could be possible for the mind? And so ultimately, I think what I overall left behind was this idea for directly training myself to become happier. And it was odd and sort of strangely stupid on my part. I read Jonathan's book, The Happiness Hypothesis, when I was in Bali, literally as one of the first ones.
Mm-hmm.
And he had that as a conclusion in his book. So I basically knew what I ultimately learned right from the beginning. But I had read it, but not experienced it and not internalized it. And that, of course, is the gigantic difference. Because ultimately, I think that many of those self-help books that, it's quite easy to make fun of them and quite easy to dismiss them. But many of them have actually quite good content. The problem with them is that they're a book.
Yeah, application is everything.
it's just basically you reading a book or I reading a book doesn't supply enough engagement for me to properly understand the content and be able to actually apply it to my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, which was a long process, we worked on the film for 8 years. In that process of making the film and being very engaged with that sort of content, but also, with talking to scientists, going through it, I ultimately, I think, understood Jonathan's conclusion about a year after we finished filming. And those conclusions really are that I can't really make myself happier or run after happiness itself. But what I can do is I can look at let's say, the 3 big areas in my life, which would be my working life, my relationship life, and let's say my life that is connected to something that's bigger than me. And of course, often those areas overlap. But what I can do is I can look at my working life, and I can see how I can increase the quality of that working life and push it onto a level where then here and there from in between, certain kinds of happiness can come out from in between. And I can do the same thing with my relationships, the far ones and the close ones, my lover, my family, and distant relatives. And I can see how I can move those relationships up to a level where again that is possible. And I can try to do the same with something that's bigger than me. For many people, this might be religion, or this might be a cause, global warming, or a political cause, or something that's not just concentrating on themselves. For me, it is often a bigger subject that might be, let's say, beauty, where we did a lot of work on. But that's the subject itself is much bigger than I myself. And if I do this on all those 3 levels, when I don't expect it, when I don't run after it, little happinesses might come out of it. And I found that that completely became true for me in the last sabbatical when I was working on beauty in Mexico City, which was just a fantastic time. It was a great situation where I had created some of these things. Like I had created a possibility for my work life to be that, and I had created a possibility for something that's bigger than me to be that. And my relationships were going well too. But probably I had worked less on that, but I've definitely created a great situation. And it really was an exceptionally happy time. Now that, of course, doesn't mean that I'm going to swim in a sea of happiness for the rest of my life. Of course it doesn't. But I would say it's been an exceptionally good couple of years since. Most scientists think that if you want to figure out how happy you are going to be in the future, the easiest and most precise ways to do it is to see how happy you were in the past, because about 50% of how happy you are is DNA. And that's, of course, bad news in many ways, because I mean, it's a lottery. It's like, you were just born with it that way. But that still means that the other 50%, you can become better. And I mean, I would say that even in sports, how high I ultimately am going to be able to jump has a lot to do with my DNA. But I can still train to jump quite a bit higher, even with my own limited possibilities, even if I don't have the DNA to wind up to be a world champion high jumper, I can still improve. And I think that the very, very same is true for your happiness, ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's the rewiring. It's not rewiring and being able to have a greater capacity of overall happiness, or being able to compete with, someone who's way out of the zone. It's about, how do I have, and that's what I was going to say. The creative tension is between the awareness of where your current state is and where your potential is. Yes. And when you're looking at that, so even when you talk about how well the following year, in Mexico City, perhaps some of that was that you were paying so much attention to what your happiness level looked like prior to that. You had something to measure against. And if you grew complacent or you felt it dipping, you could nurture it a little bit more, because it's easy to let go of it and let it kind of just fall in the background.
Well, Brian, I actually think it had, you see, like in those 8 years, I was very data specific, and I had done, every second day a video interview. I had done a daily measurement of how happy I felt that day on a measure from 1 to 10. I had done a weekly thing. So I've kept all that data. And then very consciously, as soon as we presented the film at the Tribeca Film Festival, I stopped with all that measuring. But that conclusion from Jonathan had stayed with me. And I did consciously look at, so my work life, and I of course am privileged in many, many ways because I run my own design studio. So I have great influence of how that studio is run and how I want to do that. And I, of course, with the sabbaticals, was able to engineer my working life pretty into a space in how exactly I wanted it to be. And I'm very aware this is a difficult thing to do. And normally I would say that, very few people can do it. But having done a online thing on my sabbaticals, and that online thing on my sabbaticals actually has been seen by literally millions of people. I forgot by how many, but by many millions of people. I do get feedback I run into people that say, in your lecture on sabbaticals, and I've done one too. So of course, and I've met by now probably hundreds of people who came up to me like that. Or at the very least, many, many, many dozens.
I'm kind of on one of those right now, and you were part of the inspiration. I didn't even really connect those dots, but that was one of the things when I heard you were doing, and for everyone listening, and Stefan, please correct me if I'm off, but every 7 years, instead of retiring, you said every 7 years, I'm going to take a year off and use it to just explore and take in new inspiration and bring that back to the work. And that was so profound for me, because most everyone is working in this rat race just to get to this destination of retirement. And most people, once they get there, it's not what they thought it was going to be. And you all of a sudden said, you know what? There's a different way. And what that did for me, and I'm sure why, partly why it has affected so many others, is you gave permission. You gave permission to say, wait a minute, I don't have to do it that way. I could rewrite it. And how does that work for me? And that's powerful.
I can tell you, when I ask these people, so how was it? I almost never get an answer that isn't connected to somehow glassy eyes of excitement. And it's constantly, I hear the terms best thing I've ever done in my life. Completely changed my thing around. I mean, constantly. Then, of course, I ask about, their situation. And I was super surprised that some of those people were poor, some of those people were rich, some of those people had families, some of those people were single, some of those people worked for giant corporations, some of those people were self-proprietors, some of those people, literally from every walk of life. And what it took from all of them, specifically the first one, it took a lot of guts because it's scary. My first sabbatical was really scary. I completely had to talk myself into it because I thought, oh my God, the studio will be forgotten. It will look unprofessional. People will think that I'm not really serious about what I'm doing. And interestingly, none of those things are true. It's that they were all assumptions in my head that it will be perceived that way.
Yeah, those stories, we all carry them, and they could be so powerful. And I think there's a Mark Twain quote, and I'll butcher it, but it goes along the lines of, I've experienced terrible things throughout my life. Fortunately, they've never existed outside of my head.
Yes.
And it's just that. And so, right now I'm actually sitting in, we bought an RV and I gut renovated it. Yeah. And my wife, myself, and our 3.5-year-old are on a cross-country trip with no destination. People keep asking. We're like, we don't know. At the end of the day, we take out a map and we just start looking at it and thinking about, where's next. And there's such an exhilaration, a freedom, and an inspiration. I could see how it informs all of the other, work you would go do in the design realm, because I'm experiencing that where I just want to create and digest what I'm experiencing it and express it in a meaningful way. So I think there's something to it. I hope.
So I'm talking to you while you're in an RV right now?
Yeah.
Well, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
that's a pretty nifty fabric you have on your RV sofa behind you there.
And talk about those stories that we carry. I was like, okay, I should probably just get a neutral and keep it safe. And and then my wife and I were like, wait, what the hell are we talking about? If there's ever a time to just go funky and bold, now's the time. So, yeah.
Wonderful. So if you look at that curtain behind you, is there a window behind that?
Yes. Here, let's open it up. So we got last night we drove from Shenandoah National Park, and we're in Asheville, North Carolina. We rented an Airbnb so that we could have internet. Oh, this is my son's sticker art.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Decals on.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you could see there's trees outside.
Sure. Excellent. Yeah. So what do you do for Wi-Fi?
Good question. And, we're 5 days in, so we're still learning a lot here.
This is new. Fantastic.
Yeah, this is very new. So I got a wireless hotspot, a company called Solis, SOLIS, and that taps into a couple of different cell networks. And then, if I need to get work done, I try to batch it and do it in an area where we have connection. And then as much as I could just unplug, I could do that.
And you said your son is 3.5?
Yeah. So he's 3.5.
So meaning that's also close quarters for 3 people with a 3.5, or for 2 people and the 3.5-year-old.
Oh yeah, it is. And so we have to work some of that out. There's an upper bunk here. I'll show it to you. I don't know if you could see, that's a bunk up there. Oh, notice you'll appreciate this. I put tin ceilings
beautiful in. Fantastic. This is very New York.
Yeah, again, if you're gonna do it, if you're gonna buy an old RV, you might as well get funky with it. So it's close quarters. We're figuring it out, but it's very similar to some other experiences. Like my wife and I had gone to Burning Man back in 05, 07, and 09, and there's some definite correlations. One of the big things they preach is radical self-reliance. And so it's this notion of like, all right, figure it out, whatever it takes, let's figure it out and be creative problem solvers. And so far, it's working, not without its hiccups, but we'll see. We'll see how long we last.
Excellent. Wonderful.
You partly inspired that. So thanks for your sabbaticals.
Wow. Well, then I hope that when we talk next, that you'll have glassy eyes.
I hope so. I do. I do. And so I'm curious, outside of the film, what other practices have you tried, and which ones are you still incorporating into your, day?
Well, I have to say that in, let's say, all of the three, like all three strategies I had tried in the film, I felt that they all worked.
Meditation, therapy, and
and
medication.
and medication. Yes, I would say that the one that I probably would go the quickest back to, if I wanted to solve something in my life, would be therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that ultimately that, and this is personal, like I think that it specifically cognitive therapy seemed very commonsensical to me. Basically, you're looking at the situation of your life, you're looking at how you react to particular situations, you're checking with your therapist, did that reaction make sense? If it did, fantastic. If it didn't, how can I change that? And is there homework for me to train to change that? So it was very much like, it was like learning something, but not much more complicated than, I don't know, than learning Spanish. Like, it's a set that you can really look at. So I probably would go back to that the easiest. I also have to say that I found that just general exercise, doesn't really matter if it's running or biking or cardio or whatnot, actually seemed to make an even bigger difference in my regular day than meditation did. And it was funny because we at one time talked to brain scientists at Columbia, and I mentioned that casually. And they were all like, yeah, I think the science would support you there. And but there's so much, science on, or what seems like good science on meditation out there. And they were more like, yeah, we're not quite sure how authoritative that really is. But on the correlation between exercise and well-being, there is a lot of really good science.
Yeah, and I'm with you right there experientially. If I don't get my exercise in, I'm not as good of a person. I'll put it that way. And meditation helps me, but I need to have that baseline of exercise and wellness before, because it's more subtle, I find.
Exactly. I would say that the biggest feelable difference in my day was when I went running 20 minutes properly in the morning. And that now, I now exchange that, but it's, ultimately it's the same thing. I do a cardio thing, and I'm doing it because it's the most fun. I'm doing it with VR glasses on. Like friends
Cool.
of mine wrote this fantastic app for, for Oculus. It's called Supernatural. And you're basically, they transport you visually into some fantastic landscape somewhere in the world, from, Lake Powell to Iceland to some crater in South America to monuments like, Chichen Itza or Machu Picchu. And you're working out there, trying to hit spheres that are shot at you really hard with a red and a black baseball-like bat. And you have to squat into triangles. So it's, from an exercise point of view, nothing but cardio. But considering it comes with really good music and beautiful landscapes, the hump you have to jump over in the morning to actually do it is very low.
Yeah, and it sounds fun. I think that's one of the key factors in, all of these pursuits of happiness, of greatness in our work and anything that we pursue in life. If we can't find fun and playfulness in it, is it really, is it really going to be worth it
Yeah,
at the end of the day? And so I think that's that's a key one that I try
yeah,
to work on constantly. I fail a
yeah,
lot at it, especially having a 3.5-year-old. I see so quickly the second I get tensed up or frustrated, I'm in a losing battle. But if I could just keep humor and playfulness and have fun with it, it changes the whole experience.
yeah. Meaning, no doubt.
I guess I'd love to, because I'm sure we have a lot of designers listening, and they're gonna attack me if we don't get into some of your process for design. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach your projects and yeah, what that's looking like these days?
And obviously, that changed over the years. And it's uh, I think the process. Let's say if you're designing an album cover for a band, if you're designing a brand for a company, or now that I'm doing basically all self-initiated projects, is somewhat different. But let's say right now, sort of the subject that is of big interest to me is long-term thinking. It's just something that incredibly captured me, because I have so many friends who are on Twitter and on cable TV news and somehow got it into their mind that we live in terrible times. Today, there is an op-ed in the New York Times of a guy who is questioning if he should bring kids into a world that is as terrible as this. And I know, because I really looked at the data, that if you look at anything, any human endeavor from the long perspective, which in my case is mostly 200 years, because it's very long, but it also has the advantage that there's still very good data around. Over 200 years, basically everything became better. And that might even sound strange to many of us, because we've been so conditioned by the news that everything is so awful. But I think there's many things in play here. One is that we as people take negative news more seriously than positive news. And that comes from our prehistoric ancestors through the amygdala. If we don't see the lion, we're dead. If we don't see the banana, we'll see another one.
Yeah, that lizard brain is always on high alert.
Part of that is just the human condition. Another part is that most journalists now see their job to report things that don't work. That that's their definition of their job. And it's not really, they don't really see it as their job to talk about the things that do work. Then there is most things that do work, do so, and that become better, increase slowly, so it doesn't really lend itself to news. So there's many reasons for that situation.
Mm-hmm. And then social media is the other part of the media where people are looking and guided by the same levers. And what you were talking about from the happiness project, the happiness film, also applies here. When you have awareness of where your current level of happiness is, or whatever you want to define it as, and you have the understanding of the context of your capacity, you can focus on achieving something related to yourself and not these external factors. And I think that's one of the biggest issues we see, is when people are so attached to and guided by getting, the quantifiable likes or comments, and just chasing someone else's version instead of defining it themselves.
And but also within the film editing, it became 100% clear to me that everything where I looked like an idiot was super interesting, and everything where I looked really good was completely, totally boring. So we had to cut so many things of people saying great things about me, because it was boring even for me, but it would have been incredibly even more boring for other people.
Interesting.
So those same mechanisms also worked in the film, but also I think that what's amazing to me is I started to really think about this long-term project when I was in Rome, and I attended this fantastic salon-like dinners at the American Academy in Rome. Every night, 40 to 50 super smart people, always you were mixed up. And one night I had this lawyer sitting next to me who told me that what we are seeing now is the end of liberal democracy, with what's happening in Poland and Hungary and in Turkey. And that night I looked it up. When did liberal democracy start? How did it develop? Well, it started 200 years ago with the United States. Then 15 or 20 years later, you had about 8 liberal democracies. That became about 30 after World War I, became about 50 after World War II, and now we have almost 100, 98. So it's actually the first time in human history that more than half of the world population lives in a democratic system. And what's interesting to me was that this is a highly educated, super smart guy who has no clue about the world that he lives in. He completely, utterly got it wrong. We live in the golden age of liberal democracy. That doesn't mean that, of course, some of these democratic countries are somewhat in trouble. That's what it means to be in a democracy. If they wouldn't be democracies. It's the definition of it. But there has never been, and this is not an opinion, this is demonstrably true. There is fantastic data from the UN about it. There has never been a moment in history when the world population was more democratic than today. I realized that this is what's happening. I thought I should make some bigger work on this, because I just found it interesting that somebody who is very smart could get factual concerns so very, very wrong. And there's many of my friends, think with different subjects, this would be the case.
That's the challenge with having information be so accessible. It's and especially in a fast-paced world where you can't fact check everything.
You mentioned the fast pace, and that has a lot to do with it. That's one factor, is that the shorter the news cycle, that by definition, the more negative the news. And you can quickly even check that for yourself. If you look at your monthly magazine, which hardly exists anymore, that monthly magazine is likely more even-keeled and less scandal-ridden than the weekly or the daily or the hourly or Twitter. The shorter the cycle, the more things that have a scandalous part of it become part of the foreground. And now, of course, that the large news organizations are either very influenced by Twitter or have their own tweet-like part of it, that they are also very much influenced. There is a wonderful sentiment study that also looks at the New York Times, but looks at 120 big news sources, and you can see how much more negative these sources have become over the past 50 years, simply driven by the shortening of the cycle.
It's fascinating.
And let's say I read the New Yorker. Already I can see that the New Yorker is less negative overall than, let's say, the New York Times. But you'll see that in every single one of the publications.
Yeah, I think it's important when we're looking at different sources and publications to really understand what the currency is that is driving them. And this goes with social media as well, because different platforms have different currency. And the only one I've really seen that contends with the fear and anxiety mongering is the inspiring, the ones that truly inspire. And that actually makes me think of, so I know that you had an opportunity a while back to work for one of your heroes, Tibor Kalman. Can you give a little touch on what that was like working with one of your idols?
Well, that's a very good while ago. This was my last job before I opened my own design studio, and Tibor had a particular knack to look at other people's situation and be able to give them advice that they could hear. Very often you get advice that might actually be well meant or or might be true, but you can't hear it. And somehow Tibor was able to do that, and he definitely did it with me in many forms. He did it way before I used to work for him, and he did it after I worked for him. Let's say, like, one thing that I mentioned often was that when I opened then my own studio, I asked him, so what should I watch out for? And he said, well, the only difficult thing in running a design studio is to figure out how not to grow. If you figure out that, everything else is super easy. And that I took that seriously, tried as good as I could not to grow. Then when Jessica became a partner, we grew anyway, because I also needed to let her be able to do her thing. But ultimately for me, the smallness is still by far my favorite way of working. And I still believe that even the larger jobs that we've done with more people involved, we probably could have done them better with a smaller team. And I've seen that really well, even with the Happy Film. The smaller we were when shooting, the more effective and the better the outcome.
That's a great tip. Are there any other, is there anything else that you would say to the designers out there as they're doing their thing in the world?
Well, I would say take form and beauty much more seriously than you do right now. Meaning, I used to be a designer who was totally concept and idea driven and thought of style or beauty or any of the formal attribute, be it shape or color or materiality. I thought of all of those as sort of, small contributions that have to come out of the idea, but don't have any particular value by themselves. And through experience, I completely had to change my mind about that. I mean, I still think that a good concept is helpful, but I also think the beauty of a project is completely responsible for the utility of that project and for the functionality of that project. That we just found out that whenever we took form seriously, the project seemed to work much, much better. And of course, when we then turned out to make a big project about it, and I did a lot of research on it, it turned out that the big giants of modernism, so the guys that were responsible for ultimately the functionalism in the second part of the 20th century, all had learned within their lifetime that pure function leads to projects that don't function, ironically. That you need beauty as part of the goal within your project for a project to be good, for it to be fit for human consumption. So in a very strange way, we arrived at beauty through function. And I'm so wary now of designers who call themselves problem solvers, that basically see their job as purely as solving a problem. And I find that if that's the sole way you're going to approach it, you're likely solving the problem badly, because you're leaving all these other functionalities on the table. This is particularly bad for online, for all the people who work in user interface or user experience, where problem solving is basically the rule of the day. And I think so many of us are so frustrated online because we are presented, or we are in spaces that are purely functional, and they don't feel good. They feel like the equivalent of the 1960s public housing project. Yes, you have a roof above your head, and if you're lucky, it doesn't leak, but the crime rates have gone up. There is a lot of aggression everywhere you go, and the first chance you have of leaving that public housing project, you will take it, because it doesn't really feel good to live there. Mm-hmm. And many online spaces feel like that. But you're checking out as quickly as you can because you don't really want to be there. It's not a joyful experience. And I think that the designers who figure out how to do this on scale, how to make this experience beautiful and joyful, they will have the world as their oyster. They will become the richest, they will become the best compensated, but they will also win all the awards, and people will feel the most thankful to them.
And probably the happiest. Well, Stefan,
yes.
Thank you so much for your time. This was so great to dive into conversation with you, and I hope to do it again in the future.
Brian, it was a pleasure. Wonderful.
Thanks for joining us this week on Growth Guide. A big thanks to our sponsors. This episode is sponsored by Project New You. I'm a huge fan of their Nitrovite nootropic brain supplement. It's helped me to develop laser focus, a better memory recall, and motivation. Nitrovite has helped me in launching this podcast amongst completing many other projects. Visit growthguide.love/focus to learn more and use promo code GROWTH for 15% off. This episode is also sponsored by the upcoming film Thrive 2. This is what it takes. A follow-up to the 2011 hit Thrive, which is one of the most widely viewed documentaries in history with over 90 million views. If creating a better world matters to you, don't miss it. Visit growthguide.love/thrive. Make sure to visit our website, growthguide.love, where you can find freebies, exclusive content, and subscribe to the show so you'll never miss an episode. If you found value in listening, I'd really appreciate a rating on iTunes. I can't tell you just how important this is. Or spread the love. Tell your friends, your fam, heck, tell your spirit animals. And follow me on Instagram at growthguide.love. Be sure to tune in next week for our newest episode.